If you read science fiction, chances are at least you know the name of Philip K. Dick. He wrote dozens of novels, short stories, and essays which explored themes of identity, reality, technology, spirituality. He received numerous awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, British Science Fiction Award. Heck, there's an award named after him, the Philip K. Dick Award. However, behind his creative genius lay a troubled mind that struggled with mental health issues throughout his life. He had a history of depression, anxiety, paranoia, drug addiction, which of course affected his personal and professional life. He died at the relatively young age of 53, 4 months before the release of Blade Runner, an adaptation of his novel To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. Less commonly known is he had a strange connection to the FBI and CIA, which monitored his activities for years due to his political views and associations. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a super fan of Philip K. Dick. I find a lot of his writing rather dense. I don't think he's that accessible of an author to get into. That said, it hasn't stopped me from reading his works like Police, which I don't suggest you start with, but he is an iconic science fiction writer who inspired a generation of authors with his visionary concepts and storytelling. Now, I've just had a report that Philip K. Dick is attending a conference in France, which would be the perfect opportunity to interview him. Unfortunately, the conference took place in 1977, so we are going to have to hop into our TARDIS and give him a visit. Hello, Philip K. Dick. It is such a great pleasure to meet you. Perhaps you've heard of me. I am the BookTube Goddess, the #1 drag queen booktuber on YouTube. Okay, well, first off, I have to ask, what are you even doing here in Europe? Do the French know who you are? Do they even take science fiction seriously?
I discovered that in Europe, especially in France, science fiction was taken seriously, and the science fiction writer was not regarded as something on the level of a janitor. And my delight was enormous, and my amazement was enormous, and my agent was quite pleased. And I began to meet people from France who would come over and visit me. A gentleman who was doing his dissertation on a novel of mine came to visit me. And I was simply amazed. I could not imagine anyone taking science fiction seriously. Now, as far as my own work went, I had written what I considered to be serious novels, but they never received any great popularity in America.
Hold on, let's back up a second. Science fiction authors are considered janitors in the United States. What do you mean by that?
The position which writers such as myself hold in America those positions are very lowly. Science fiction is considered to be something for adolescents, for just high school kids, and for disturbed people in general to read in America. And the publishers will buy a novel which must meet rigid moral standards, the standards which librarians have, which has to do with sex and violence and so forth. So we are limited in our writing to books which have no sex, no violence, and no deep ideas. Just something of an adventure kind of nature, what we call space opera, which is just westerns set in the future. And this is a strong pressure on us. The field, science fiction, is just a genre there, ranked at the level of nurse romance publications. We are considered at the bottom rung. Now, it's not as bad today as it was a few years ago, because recently the academic community has discovered us, and there are scholarly articles being written in America about science fiction. And also, the science fiction novels are being used in courses at universities and high schools and colleges. In fact, one of my novels is used even in a course in the modern novel, not just as a science fiction novel, but as an example of the modern novel. But that's rare. And the general attitude is still highly prejudicial in America. Now, I started out as a pulp writer, doing stories for pulp magazines, and I never imagined myself to have any importance. So I was not dismayed by this attitude. I just took it for granted. I had been a clerk in the store, and I was used to having people yell at me and tell me what to do. And so to find myself a writer and yelled at and told what to do did not surprise me.
But you are a very successful writer in the United States. Hasn't your work done very well in the U.S.? Can you share any publishing statistics?
The largest number of sales of any novel of mine was Solar Lottery, which sold something over 300,000 copies. Man in the High Castle, which I won the Hugo Award for, sold by now it sold over 300,000 copies. But by and large, the average American science fiction novel sells about 40 to 50,000 copies, which in a country the size of the United States is a very small portion of the reading public.
But surely there have been some breakout science fiction novels in the U.S.
Now, there are exceptions, of course, like the Andromeda Strain, which become bestsellers.
Oh, I love the Andromeda Strain.
But these always are highly promoted by the publisher and usually involve very simplistic ideas, such as a disease from outer space. Ideas that are archaic, they're no longer really interesting ideas. They're something that H.G. Wells either wrote about or could have written.
Well, it must have been fantastic when you first saw a story of yours in print.
As I remember when I purchased my first published story, somebody said to me, "Do you read that kind of stuff?" And they said, "Madam, I not only read it, I write it." And people would say to me, "Well, why don't you write something serious? Why do you write science fiction? Write something serious." By that, they meant important. Nevertheless, I did as well as I could. I wrote the most profound, the most imaginative novel I could, and just floated it out into the world and hoped that eventually it would receive an audience.
You don't seem very fond of your home country. What has your relationship been with the United States?
And my relationship with the United States has always been a very bad one. It has always seemed to me that I was about to be arrested by the American police for some obscure reason. And perhaps that's because of reading Kafka's The Trial. That book influenced me very much, where someone is arrested for a crime and he is never told what crime he has committed. And in Berkeley, we were very radical. And there's a Bob Dylan song. He says, whatever it was you were doing, you don't know what it was, but the police say you're doing it again, something like that. And I always had that feeling, and it was a symbol of my sense of alienation from my own country's culture. I mean, they didn't read my books, and I didn't like them, and I didn't feel any affinity, any relatedness to my neighbors and the population in general.
It sounds like you were persecuted by the police.
I remember one time my fear of the police was so great that whenever I saw a parked police car and I was driving along, I would ask my wife to stop our car and I would surrender to the police on the spot to whatever crime they wanted to accuse me of.
Did the police ever tell you why they were after you?
Well, the police once told me that I was a crusader and they had no use for crusaders. But unfortunately, they didn't tell me what I was crusading for. I was afraid to ask what it was I was the crusader for. And they told me that if I did not get out of the county, I would be shot in the back or worse some night. And I merely took their advice. I left the United States and went to Canada for a while. But I never found out what I was crusading for. It may have had something to do with my writing. It may have had something to do with my lifestyle, or a combination of both. But I was too afraid of the police to ask what it was I was doing. Is that at all responsive?
Yes, it certainly did. Thank you. But did that inspire or influence your writing at all?
This attitude of mine shows up in my recent novel, A Scanner Darkley, where a narcotics agent winds up reporting on himself, turning over information on himself to his higher-ups.
This all happened during the Nixon administration. What was it really like back then?
The paranoia of the Nixon period was so great by the government and also by the counterculture, the Berkeley people. Anybody like me who grew up and was part of the Berkeley counterculture became a marked man during the Nixon administration. It is impossible to tell how much of our fears were justified. I mean, there were illegal entries. My house was broken into, my files were blown open, my papers were stolen. We never found out who did it. My attorney said it was the government. There was no doubt that it was the government. But what they were looking for, I don't know. What they thought I was doing, I don't know. I don't even know if it was the government. But there were many such illegal entries, and an experience like that tends to make you very paranoid, you know, that you are suspected of some crime. But like in Kafka's The Trial, they never told me what it was I had done. They just told me I was a crusader, and they didn't have any need for crusaders.
But you were a famous writer. Didn't that provide you any sort of protection?
The fact that I was an intellectual and a writer only made me more suspicious in their eyes. You've got to take into account that in the United States, to be an intellectual, to be a writer, is to wear a sign on your back saying, I am an enemy of the state. I mean, it is something that is hard to understand, I think. There is such an anti-intellectual attitude in America. It's incredible, the suspicion that the authorities have of what they used to call eggheads.
Eggheads. That's funny.
They used to call intellectuals eggheads. It was a term of derision. And the term originated in Nazi Germany. Most people don't know this. I happen to know this because I did a lot of research into Nazi Germany for my novel, Man in the High Castle. The term egghead was used by the Sturmabteilung SA. It referred to the fact that when they beat up people who were defenseless, their skulls cracked so readily against the pavement that the term egghead was evolved by the Sturmabteilung, and that term was carried over into the United States without any knowledge of its origin. However, the fact that that is the origin of the term egghead, which is the term used for American intellectuals, that origin tells a great deal about the kind of people who would use such a term.
Okay, not that funny. Obviously, you were extremely paranoid during that period. Is that still with you today?
I lost that kind of apprehension abruptly in 1974 when the Nixon administration ceased to exist. I doubt if the paranoia was irrational, considering the government that the United States had. Had my paranoia been irrational, it probably would have persisted after the Nixon government was deposed. But in March of 1974, the government's program of spying on dissident anti-war intellectuals, the so-called COINTELPRO, was abandoned, and in March of 74, my so-called paranoia disappeared completely. I felt a lifting of the oppression, the sense that there was a watching police agency which was monitoring our activities. I felt that sense lift in March of 74 and has never returned. And it was in March of 74 that the CIA's Operation Chaos, which was to harass, disrupt, and keep surveillance on American dissidents, and was officially abandoned. So the kind of paranoia which Michael DeMuth noted, which was real, was based on the fact that we were harassed. We were under surveillance. We really were. There was no doubt about it whatsoever. I've seen my CIA file. I've seen my FBI file. Under the American Freedom of Information Act, I was legally allowed to see both files. The CIA opened my mail. The FBI had a file on me. I've seen both. And I no longer have this sense of the police activity. It depends a little on what you mean by paranoia. If you mean a psychotic conviction that you are being persecuted, which is not in accord with reality, I don't think I had that. But boy, I sure thought the cops were watching everything I did, and I was correct. I was tipped off by the criminal underground that my house was being watched. The license plate numbers of every car that stopped in front of my house was taken, and these were not part of my imagination. These were actual events. Anyone who visited me, the license plate number was written down by the people next door, and I was told the house was being watched, and that eventually my house would be hit, my files would be opened, my papers would be taken, and so it came to pass. As I said in the Rolling Stone article on me, when I came home and found my house consisting of nothing but rubble, ruins, chaos, broken windows, smashed doorknobs, blown open files, I said, thank God I'm not crazy. I might have real enemies. It was a tremendous relief to discover that somebody really is after me.
Okay, obviously I did not travel back in time to interview Philip K. Dick. You knew that, right? I found this interview on YouTube. In fact, it's in a couple of places on YouTube, but the audio quality made it really difficult to listen to, so I went ahead and did some magical audio adjustments to make it easier to hear, hopefully. And I'll fix up the entire interview and post it on YouTube in the next day or two if you are interested in hearing the whole unedited version. What I'm interested in is what you think. Are you a Philip K. Dick fan? Let me know down in the comments and tell me what your favorite Philip K. Dick work is. Mine is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is really a whole different experience than Blade Runner, and I recommend you checking it out if you haven't already. If you want more videos like this, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.